On behalf of all of us at IIMB, I welcome you all to the first PN Thirunarayana Memorial Lecture, and also would like to thank our chief guest, our faculty members, alumni, students, staff, that all of us make this wonderful institute. So I apologize for the delay, but I'm sure the next 1 hour is going to make up for it. So thanks again for coming. And may I now request Professor Raghunath to introduce our keynote speaker and also explain the purpose of the evening. Professor Raghunath.
This is a very emotional day for all of us. We have been trying to plan this for a number of months, and we've been very glad and very fortunate that Mr. Rajeev Bakshi finally had the time in his life, because he's a very, very busy person. He is the managing director of Metro Cash and Carry, a growing multinational in this country, and I'm very glad and very grateful to you that you have made this occasion possible. So thank you very much. Let me briefly introduce him. He's right now the managing director of Metro Cash and Carry. Prior to this, he had a career for about 30 years. He was in senior leadership positions in companies like ICICI Ventures, PepsiCo International, and Cadbury. As the joint managing director of ICICI Ventures, he led the real estate practice and managed consumer-oriented investments like retail and life sciences. During his tenure as the chairman of Pepsi India, he successfully led the company to consolidate their foothold in India. He also held the position of Senior Vice President Commercial Asia Pacific for PepsiCo. He has held various senior positions in Cadbury in sales, as Sales and Marketing Director for India Operations, Regional Marketing Director for Africa and Middle East, Managing Director of Cadbury India, and then Managing Director of Cadbury's South Africa Operations. He started his career in sales at Lakme India and went on to head marketing, followed by sales and marketing functions at Lakme. He's held very senior positions in the national councils of industry bodies such as CII and FICCI. He is an alumnus, which year is 79, and a graduate from St. Stephen's College, Delhi. So please join me in welcoming him. Before we listen to him, I will now request him to release the memoir on Thiru, which is there in front of you. This is a memoir put together by Sumit Chowdhury, alumnus of IIMB. You want to stand up? And his team, Hemanth and Sulekha. So may I now request you to deliver the Thiru Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rangnath, operating guy, a practicing marketeer. I'm completing almost about 35 years now, this year, in the Indian marketing stroke sales scene as well as general management. And of course, I have had myriad of experiences in the Indian context as such. Also some in the international context, but my main expertise lies in terms of what I want to talk to you today about. The first part is, of course, a bit of history, in the sense that my experiences with marketing over the last 3 decades. I started with Lakme. In Lakme, of course, I was the marketing manager from 1986 to 1992, in which basically if you came to my offices in Bombay, I normally had, let's say, nail paints on my hands, lipsticks on my arms, and was deciding the future and the fashion trends of all the women in the country. Exciting times. In fact, that actually laid a groundwork for many things in the future. After that, of course, I took over as Cadbury India Sales and Marketing Director in 1992, and I'll show you the work we did in those years. And subsequently, after a brief stint in the UK, I came back as the Managing Director in India. And that was a very exciting time, in the sense that it was the 90s, it was the time of liberalization, it was a time of changing business models, it was a time of changing marketing paradigms, it was the time of launching new categories, and of course the birth of consumerism in the country. Followed by that, I went to South Africa briefly and came back to actually take over PepsiCo in India. I was running that company for about 6.5 years in the early 2000s. Very tumultuous years. In fact, I don't know if some of you remember, this was the pesticides controversy which actually erupted at that time for a period of 4 years. And I lived through that, I managed that, and in fact I became a star. And I'll show you why I became a star, because I starred in one television commercial, which I'll show you today. So therefore, I think that was a very, very rich experience. So after having been in Lakme, Cadbury, as well as PepsiCo in pretty senior positions, I decided to take a sabbatical and say, fine, enough is enough, let me get my daughter married off, which is what I did for 6 months. And then I was deciding what to do. I did actually sort of do a brief stint in ICICI Ventures, but I think the timing was absolutely wrong, because we were on the road to actually raise $6 billion of capital, but the month I joined, Lehman Brothers collapsed. So the entire private equity industry actually went through the floor, and that's the time I had to sort of figure out as to what to do with my life. And that's the time I said, no more FMCG for me, I've done enough in India. Being, let's say, the head of Cadbury and PepsiCo for many years, for over a decade actually, it didn't make sense for me to go back to the FMCG business. So therefore I said, okay fine, what is it for me? And given, let's say, that my DNA says that I'm a creative person in the sense that I create categories, I create companies, I decided to join a new actually industry, which was the wholesale retail industry. I've been here for about 3.5 years, and it's important that basically in these 3.5 years, the entire pattern of this industry is changing, and has changed quite dramatically. And I will try and explain to you how. So I'll talk a little bit in my talk today about my experiences over the 3 decades. I'll be slightly brief, I won't be very elaborate. Show you a few commercials. They may be a little dated, but at the same time, they are a sign of the times as such in those years. Subsequently, I'll obviously talk to you about, let's say, the current situation as far as the retail industry is concerned and the wholesale industry is concerned, and tell you some insights, or give you some insights as to what the dynamics are connected with, let's say, the customer dynamics and the consumer dynamics. And that is very important to understand, because I think in this situation, the people are questioning as to why the modern retail industry is not actually evolving at a fast clip. And I will tell you why, and which parts of the industry are not, and which parts can and will in the near future. Give me a minute. So let me start with actually talking about as to what the actual scenario was in qualitative terms in 1979, and how it's so dramatically changed over the last 34 years, and how I've lived through that. In fact, when I joined Lakme, very funnily, it was bad to look good. I'll tell you how. And Lakme actually had campaigns. In those days, and very much even today in certain Indian areas, interiors of the country, you have situations in which women are not allowed to wear lipsticks before marriage. If you wore lipsticks, or if you wear lipsticks, you actually are termed to be the loose fast type. And that was a fact in those days, and still is in many parts of the country. Today, as far as you guys are concerned, you guys and girls, I think it's basically exactly the opposite. It's good to be bad. You actually flaunt it at times, and this is what the youth attitudes are evolving to. A total sea change, definitely, let's say, percolating down from the top. Thrift is good to greed is good. Clearly, the values which I was brought up on, and I'm sure, let's say, some of you do come from middle class homes. Thrift is basically a way of life. Thrift is basically what is drummed into us as values. Today, it's exactly the opposite. Hard work over smart work, but it's smart work over hard work. I think you relate to this, I'm sure. And I'm sure you beat the system out here as well, quite deliberately, which I did, of course, in my times. Things haven't changed. I think blaming the system in those days, the socialist era, it was always about a faceless government, a socialist way of working, and therefore fatalism, which was ingrained in Hinduism, also actually dovetailed into the entire, let's say, so-called way of life. And today, of course, I think being the change, and Nirbhaya is a very good example of that. The Bharat versus India, there's a very clear divide. The haves and the have-nots, the Bharats versus the Indias, in the sense the urban people versus the rural people. And today we talk about Dhoniization. In the sense, people actually from smaller towns do aspire to become big stars, and Dhoniization perhaps is a good word to reflect that. I think Dehati, when we were in college, I mean, clearly you were the Dehati guy, you were the rural guy, all right? And today it's very cool to be regional. In fact, I mean, films after films, people after people flaunt their regionality, flaunt as to which small area of India do they belong to. Very different milieu, very, very different milieu. This has huge implications in marketing, and this has huge implications, let's say, in terms of how you deal with life, how you behave, and how you do marketing, and how you actually create categories. Sarkari Naukri was the epitome. In fact, I mean, I must tell you about myself. I struggled to convince my family to send me to IIM Bangalore. Really struggled. In those days, in 1977, when I joined IIM Bangalore, I actually had a situation in which basically my father was no more in those days, and my uncle and aunts basically actually sort of really got into me in saying that no, if you join the private sector, you are going to actually sort of not be able to look after your mother in the future because the private sector salaries are so poor. In the government sector, of course, you have all these lovely government hospitals and lovely facilities and lovely perks. But that was a reality in those days. And today, it's exactly the opposite. I think the small town versus big town phenomena has totally disappeared, in my opinion. And there is basically a cylinder which is operating right through. And this sort of a demographic, this sort of a segmentation actually doesn't exist in today. So in that era, in fact, the year basically I passed out, very tough year, 1979, the Charan Singh government was in power. I don't know if any of you know who Charan Singh was. He was one of the prime ministers of the country who lasted for a few months. But at the same time, he was basically from Bagpat, the agricultural heartland of, let's say, Western UP. And he obviously was absolutely a socialist guy, pro-agriculture. And believe it or not, I mean, you curse excise duties today of, let's say, 18% and 20%. When I joined Lakme, the excise duty on cosmetics in those days was 117%. 117%. I mean, how the hell do you actually sort of get into business development and create a product proposition in those days with no technology available, local technology? I think the marketing and sales careers in those days were aspirational. Very clearly, much above, let's say, any other sector, because funnily the other sectors did not exist. Banking did not exist. Consultancies did not exist as such. So therefore, the so-called, let's say, marketing and sales careers were absolutely sought after in those days. Clearly, I think even in advertising, which anybody today will not actually prefer, or anybody will not even consider, forget, let's say, IIM Bangalore, but even, let's say, the Institute number 40 would not consider that, was basically aspirational. The cream de la cream actually went into advertising. And at the same time, I think what used to happen in those days was that you actually had a situation in which you had the cream going into this particular sector. And a very funny dichotomy emerged in the sense that you had the best brains in the country being in advertising and marketing with the worst possible tools. The worst possible tools being product, technology, right, offerings, nothing available, backed by a situation in which basically the consumer spending power was very limited. So as a consequence, you actually had a very shallow market, a languishing economy, in which the economy was basically running at, let's say, in the region of 3 to 4%, industrial growth stagnant, and a very mythical middle class. In those days, we used to have a very favorite term called PPP, purchasing power parity. And purchasing power parity, to my mind, is a myth. It is, let's say, of no consequence in the marketing world. The actual nominal money which you have and the middle class which it has in dollars is what counts. So if anybody feeds you today in terms of, let's say, talking about purchasing power parity and how deep consumerism is in India, I think, to my mind, it is absolutely mythical. You cannot operate with marketing, or you cannot operate with product offers basis that. Business was focused on very basic categories because pockets are not deep. On the PPP basis, yes, we talked about we are the number 4 economy and so on. But at the same time, in terms of, let's say, the brands which were offered and the categories which used to basically exist in those days, Lidl, for example, as a brand, used to be the numero uno in terms of soaps. I mean, that was basically what it was. Halo shampoo, all these brands don't exist, except Fair & Lovely, which is a mega brand today because it's gone through periods of evolution and so on and so forth. So therefore, what was happening was that the marketing thought was very sophisticated. The so-called people who were there, like my main research person, I don't know if you've heard of this lady called Rama Bijapurkar. She was my main market research person, and she was basically doing basic market research for, let's say, companies like ours, and so on, even in the late 80s. So therefore, I think attitudes towards consumption were also very poor in the sense that too much of consumption was bad, accompanied by social attitudes, which were also very negative. In the sense, social attitudes are very negative towards consumerism, very negative towards consumption. And therefore, clearly what was happening was that you actually had a distribution intensity and basically the penetration intensity being the key mantras. Differentiation was limited in park marketing tools. You did not have much to offer, essentially because if you wanted to actually advertise on television, you had one channel, Doordarshan. If you wanted to actually go into print, very expensive, you had one Femina and one Savvy and a couple of other magazines and so on. However, green shoots started emerging in the 80s, especially in the late 80s, because of basically incremental consumerism. But at the same time, the purchasing power was very limited, and the scale was obviously limited, which was backed by, let's say, very poor technology. Now, I'll show you, let's say, what the attitudes against cosmetics were, which I've talked about as such. But what used to happen in those days was that, in fact, the key mantras in those days vis-a-vis cosmetics were skin, hair, and eyes. If you actually focused on skin care, hair, and eyes, you actually escaped this attitudinal problem. In the sense, funnily, in those days, my biggest market in Lakme was Calcutta. And you know why? Basically because of skincare. Basically because they loved eyes. And they actually loved, let's say, their hair. So as a consequence, Delhi and Bombay, which basically are supposedly, let's say, the high consumption markets, were, let's say, number 2 and number 3 respectively. Delhi followed by Bombay. But you actually had the skin, and if you look at the list of, let's say, categories which are launched in those days, and this is my list, actually, this is what I launched in Lakme in the late 80s. I launched the first moisturizer in India in 1987. Right? Can you believe it? Today you actually have about 100 odd brands in moisturizing with various segments and with various variants and so on. I launched a Kajal pencil. Can you believe it? It was a breakthrough technology, by the way, in those days. Right? I launched face masks. I launched a winter care lotion. All right? And all these were hits except for hair dyes. Hair dyes didn't do well. I launched the first hair removing lotion in the country. Soft and Silky was the brand name. It doesn't exist right now. Unilever killed it. Right? But these are the categories which basically existed in those days, which were so basic. And if you see the centricity of this, is nothing else but basically your hair, eyes, and skin. If you went into color cosmetics, I mean, you are dead. In the sense you couldn't actually make money because of 117% excise duties. And at the same time, the attitude was so negative. In fact, there was a brilliant campaign which we did in 1984. I didn't do it. It was before my time. I took over marketing in 86, which was basically about, is it good to look bad? It was a path-breaking campaign. It's basically one case study which we have right now, in the advertising world at least. Let me show you the commercial in Lakme Kajal. Now, this commercial is basically not the original commercial. It stars Bipasha. It is done by Unilever. So it's Unileverized to some extent. But the original commercial was done in 86.
She can kill with a smile, she can talk with her eyes. She can ruin your day when she changes her mind. And she only reveals what she wants you to see. She acts like a child, but she's always a woman to me.
1992 is when I joined Cadbury. And that was exactly the time when liberalization took place in the country. Manmohan Singh, in his days of youth, actually, did what he did. Right? So therefore, I think when I joined Cadbury, I think it was a very interesting time, in the sense that you actually had a situation in which suddenly consumerism exploded, in the sense that you actually had lots of international companies interested, lots of companies interested in the stock market, lots of money started flowing in, lots of investment started flowing in, salaries started rising, for God's sake. I think in the 80s, the salaries were quite pathetic, if I must tell you that. In the 90s, salaries started rising. I think there was an initial situation, and I must tell you about this, and I must tell you an anecdote. I joined Cadbury in 1992, Cadbury India, as a sales and marketing director from Lakme. So the first thing which I got was that fancy flat in Cadbury House. Have you seen that Cadbury House place? How many have seen it? So I got a very nice apartment there in Bombay. It's the prime place. I got, in those days, a car known as Contessa. I don't know if you heard about that car. Big car, right? After the Ambassadors and the Fiats, that was the first innovation, right? And basically, I got, let's say, all the facilities possible. But my salary was 10,000 rupees take home. And with that salary, I mean, the point here which I'm making is that with that salary, and this is linked to this, I could not afford to buy a Tropicana juice to feed my family. Right? So therefore, the point I'm making is that you actually had a situation in which suddenly the country opened out, aspirations increased, but the so-called consumption spending was still measured in PPP terms and not necessarily, let's say, in terms of actual nominal purchasing power, so much so that even when I was a director driving a Contessa car, I was a director on the board of that company, by the way, in 1992, driving a Contessa car, living in the fanciest of apartments in Bombay, I could not afford the basics. I could not even afford to buy the furniture for my house as such. My managing director used to get a salary of 15,000 rupees. I used to get 10,000 rupees because it was capped by the company company board as such. So I think that what I'm trying to demonstrate is that while the markets opened up, industrial growth increased, but the affordability was still, let's say, a little poor. Industry was playing catch up, clearly. And there was lots of money coming in. FIRA had gone away, foreign exchange regulations, company had diluted to 51%. It was going up to, 40%, it was going up to 51%. Lots of money coming in. Most importantly, technology was coming in. Because till the late 80s, no Indian FMCG company had access to technology. Technology had to be homegrown. So we actually had engineering workshops, machine shops to create machines to produce chocolates. Right? We could not import machinery. We could not import any technology. And therefore, we had to rely on ourselves. As a consequence, what happened is that the marketing function suddenly started exploding with the advent of technology. So it was a virtuous cycle in the sense consumerism started creeping in. You had technology coming in, salaries started increasing, marketing tools became much more diverse, the channels of marketing became much more diverse. Our growth actually, let's say basically while this was happening, I must tell you about the Cadbury story in this context. And I think that's an interesting one, which is one of the highlights of my career as such. This was circa 1993, 20 years back. All right? Cadbury as a category was basically supposed to be for kids. Chocolates were supposed to be for kids. You were supposed to be guilty eating a chocolate yourself. Not many of you must have seen the advertising on the 80s. But it was almost, let's say that, for example, if you were giving a chocolate to a kid, you actually sort of, first if you were having a chocolate, you were feeling guilty about having a chocolate. So therefore, if you had a small bite, you would actually show a commercial offering it to the kid instead. You were offering it basically as a reward for doing something. So as a consequence, what was happening was the chocolates category was deemed to be very child-oriented. And therefore, growth in the 80s had slowed down to almost nothing as such. I can do a whole case study on it and tell you about it. But this is exactly what I did in 1993. And I'll show you a commercial, which all of you would love, actually, which I did in 1993, after which my career really took off as such. And I'm sure, let's say, a lot of you have already seen this commercial. But never mind, I'll show it to you again.
कुछ खास है हम सभी में, कुछ बात है हम सभी में, बात है खास है, कुछ स्वाद है, क्या स्वाद है जिंदगी में, बात है खास है, कुछ स्वाद है, क्या स्वाद है जिंदगी में। कैडबरीज डेयरी मिल्क, असली स्वाद जिंदगी का। कुछ खास है हम सभी में, कुछ बात है हम सभी में, बात है खास है, कुछ स्वाद है, क्या स्वाद है कैडबरीज डेयरी मिल्क, असली स्वाद जिंदगी का। कभी जिंदगी लगे भारी,
महकती हल्की हल्की, इसके रंग हंस के देखे, अपना ले खुशी हर पल की। कैडबरीज की नई पर्क, थोड़ी थोड़ी भारी थोड़ी थोड़ी हल्की, अपना ले खुशी हर पल की। कैडबरीज की नई पर्क, थोड़ी सी पेट पूजा कभी भी कहीं भी।
These two commercials, or these two campaigns, done in 93 and 94 respectively, changed my career. It's these inflection points which actually determine a person's career. And I'm being a little philosophical right now, but these two commercials actually got me the managing director's job in those times. First and foremost, the Cadbury commercial actually rescued Cadbury from almost insolvency. Cadbury was making a loss when I joined. And now basically when I left it in 2000, it was making world-class profits. But this Cadbury commercial actually sort of changed, and there's a whole series of them. In fact, if you see the commercials today in Cadbury, it's essentially from the same genre. It's the same trend which is carried on except with slight modifications. Two people made their careers with this commercial, especially the first one, the Cadbury commercial. I was one in terms of, let's say, Cadbury and then Pepsi, and the second one was Piyush Pandey. Piyush Pandey actually, his career got made with this commercial, believe it or not. But I think it's these so-called, let's say, inflection points in life which actually sort of suddenly dramatically change a trajectory. I was never dreaming of a managing director's job. When I was, let's say, sales and marketing head of Cadbury, I said, ho jayega. But at a young age of 39 is basically when I got that job in 1997. After 4 years of being, let's say, doing this. And 39 in a FMCG to get a marketing director's job when my predecessor was about 20 years older to me, at least. Literally, he was 60 plus. All right. I think was a phenomenal, let's say, achievement. But what I want to leave you a thought with you is basically that there are some points of inflection in life, which in marketing specifically, in which you suddenly dramatically change the course of your life. The first commercial that actually won the Commercial of the Century award, Bombay Art Club in the year 2001. It was first aired in 1994 January, and then basically in 2001 it actually got that award as the best commercial of the century. I don't know how the hell did they calculate that, but never mind, they actually gave it to me, which means the best commercial in the previous 15 years. But clearly it actually rescued Cadbury. I can do a whole case study another time on this as to what the theory behind this was. There was very elaborate theory behind this, in fact, as to why we did this. But clearly what actually happened with these commercials and what transpired is that you suddenly actually unshackled a category from being a kiddie category to telling people that you shouldn't be ashamed of actually having chocolates. I mean, that was the basic thing, without altering in any way the core values of Cadbury chocolates or the Cadbury's Dairy Milk chocolate. I think that was the basic essence of the strategy. But that's exactly how we actually sort of broke through. 2000s was an interesting time in the sense that you actually had a time, and this will very segue into, let's say, the so-called modern trade scenario. You actually had a time in which basically you did start getting into growth. You actually had new categories coming in. Telecom, for example, is a big one. But if you remember telecom in the early 2000s, what was happening in telecom was that they were still playing the penetration game. They were still talking about, let's say, so many million connections in a particular month, so much of, let's say, new connections in the previous month, and the entire competition was based on that. In the early 2000s, what used to happen was that you were still actually sort of seeing Marutis and Altos on the road, which you don't see nowadays, right? Maruti 800 and Altos, by the way. Have you ever heard of that reached to Maruti 800 now? You don't. And essentially the game was of penetration. You actually had larger number of consumers still actually consuming little, which actually meant from a consumer angle, you actually had a situation in which basically the consumer spending, in terms of surplus consumption spending, was still not significant enough to be actually getting into large categories, and especially, now I'll segue into modern trade to some extent, not sufficient enough to give modern trade a rationale to exist as such. And I will tell you as to why exactly that happens. However, lots of new categories got launched with technology. Technology now actually sort of really proliferated in this era. So from the late 90s to the early 2000s, you suddenly had technology coming in of a big order of magnitude in the anticipation that there would be, let's say, a big consumption boom, which did come about. But at the same time, you actually had a situation in which basically you had some companies like HUL, for example, languishing. Why was they languishing in early 2000s? Was essentially because they were still playing the old brand game. They were still playing the penetration game, and this is your life cycle, in which the life cycle of that category had actually gone beyond, let's say, the so-called top end was declining, but they didn't have a portfolio of new successes while they actually had personal products which were just about actually getting traction. Similarly with automobiles, it was similar in the sense that you actually had some premium products, but you still had Maruti 800s and Altos actually in the early 2000s really ruling the roost. Where the entire scenario started changing was in the year 2005. But before I get into that, let me give you a small insight into how I became a star, which I actually talked to you about earlier. And this was Pepsi and PepsiCo, let's say in year 2003, when the pesticide controversy actually hit us square on as such. And I had to face the brunt of it from the year 2003, September, I remember the date actually, to, let's say, the time I left Pepsi, or left the job actually. I went to Asia Pacific after that, in late 2006, in actually January 2007. For 4 years I battled this pesticide controversy, and it was, let's say, a low point of my career, in as much that I'm a creative guy, I'm a marketing guy, and therefore to actually sort of face government officials and bureaucracy and NGOs and actually sort of do a defensive task was a big chore for me. So Pepsi was an interesting, very interesting experience for me. It taught me a lot. But at the same time, I think the Pepsi India experience in those days, I timed it again wrong. Those 4 years were not the right time to be in PepsiCo. Although basically our market shares were at an all-time high of around 46% in those days. And kept on remaining that, and I launched a lot of categories and products. Tropicana was my launch, incidentally, in PepsiCo. Aquafina was my launch in PepsiCo, as such. But at the same time, I think it was not so brilliant in terms of, let's say, how the entire thing, how the results showed actually at the end of it. So much so that I actually had to, let's say, go from the sublime to the ridiculous. And I will show you, let's say, one commercial which I did, which is not, let's say, state of the art, but let's say, let me in any case play that, so that just to give you a flavor before I tell you as to how I became a star. Of Pepsi, but never mind.
Wow! Love your bubbles, Pepsi. Hey, bubbly, oh yeah, bubbly, be my lover, bubbly.
Hey, Bubbly, सुन ना, I want to be your lover, Bubbly. I want to be your man. समझा कर यार, please.
Hey, bubbly, oh yeah, bubbly, be my lover, bubbly.
Hey, say love लगा ले Bubbly. I want to be your man. Tell your mummy, papa, Bubbly. I'm gonna be your man. Hey, Bubbly, oh, Bubbly, be my lover, Bubbly. I wanna feel you in me, Bubbly. You're my दिल का प्यास, oh, Bubbly. कहाँ से आ जाते हैं मुंह उठा के?
सर जी मेरा चांस बबली मैं
के मन में पेप्सी के बारे में सवाल हैं, उन्हें जवाब क्या मैं दे सकता हूं? नहीं। मीडिया? नहीं। तो फिर कौन देगा जवाब?
जवाब मैं दूंगा। आपकी पेप्सी बिल्कुल सेफ है। कैसे? आइए दिखाता हूं। इस वर्ल्ड क्लास फैक्ट्री में पेप्सी की हर बोतल पर 30 अलग अलग सेफ्टी टेस्ट किए जाते हैं। पेप्सी के अंदर जाने वाले पानी को 6 स्टेज की प्योरिफिकेशन प्रोसेस से साफ किया जाता है। शुद्ध चीनी को भी हम हॉट कार्बन प्रोसेस से दोबारा साफ करते हैं। और फ्लेवरिंग तो वही है जो 150 देशों में इस्तेमाल की जाती है, यानी सारी दुनिया में सेम पेप्सी मिलती है। अब सुनिए एक्सपर्ट्स का क्या कहना है।
भारतीय और विदेशी लैब्स ने पेप्सी के हर पदार्थ की जांच की है। उनके अनुसार हर पदार्थ यानी पानी, चीनी और फ्लेवरिंग में पेस्टिसाइड्स शून्य समान है। भारतीय स्टैंडर्ड हो या विदेशी स्टैंडर्ड, आपकी पेप्सी बिल्कुल सेफ है।
पेप्सी बिल्कुल सेफ है, तुम्हारे लिए, आपके लिए, आपके बच्चों के लिए, मेरे बच्चों के लिए, और इस बात की पर्सनल गारंटी मैं लेता हूँ।
सर एक और क्वेश्चन, मेरी पेप्सी वापस मिलेगी?
Basically, I had to do that commercial in I think in July 2006, in which basically I had to star in that commercial because you actually had on the other side Amir Khan endorsing Coke against the pesticide controversy. So therefore we thought, instead of putting Shah Rukh Khan there, which will be Amir versus Shah Rukh and the tabloids will have fun, let's basically adopt a different strategy. And the strategy which we adopted basically was, this is a path-breaking one. No, I mean, there is no case study in the world actually, as per, let's say, my parent company in those days, which has even dared do this. But instead of basically sort of putting in Shah Rukh Khan up front, which you could do because he was hired by us in those days, the idea was that basically I become a star. So that's my brief interlude with stardom as such. Again, this pesticides controversy in crisis management, actually, which I did for 4 years, I think besides, let's say, the stuff which we did in Pepsi, which I haven't shown actually in the World Cups and so on, I think is again, it's textbook stuff, frankly, and lots of case studies can be done on it. I can do it on a private basis with you guys. I can't do it, let's say, in terms of writing, essentially, because it's copyright material by PepsiCo. So therefore, that's the other. So never a dull moment in my life, as such. So after PepsiCo, I have joined Metro. And Metro has been a very, very interesting experience to my mind. I think it's been a very tough experience, much more tougher than Cadbury and PepsiCo. Because at the age of 55, I mean, I was wondering as to what to do with my life. In the sense that I've run the course, been MD of, let's say, so many companies as such. 3 companies before, this is my fourth MD-ship, actually. I didn't want an international career for personal reasons. And therefore, I actually had to stay in the country. In the country, when I joined Metro, it was languishing at about 900 crores at that time, with barely existing, let's say, in Bangalore, Hyderabad, a little bit in Bombay, as such. Today, it's running at about 4,000 crores already in 3 years. And we had just opened a store just right next door, by the way, 20 minutes away, in Electronic City. And this only with 16 stores. In Bangalore, we do a turnover of over 1,000 crores. Now, why is this basically, why is cash and carry? And the model is pretty robust now in the sense that it can be replicated, it is profitable, and it can be replicated. What happened and why didn't the entire, let's say, so-called modern trade did not pick up in the early 2000s? And why is it started picking up now? And I think that's very important for you guys to understand. And that's basically a huge lesson in terms of evolution of consumerism and marketing. See, what happens is that if you actually have a traditional channel, and let me actually talk about US consumers to begin with. If I talk about US consumers to begin with, I don't know how many of you actually, when you remember 15 years back when you were growing up, if you go back 15 to 20 years back, and you look at, let's say, what are the number of shirts and trousers which your parents could afford for you, and what you have now, what difference would you find? 3x, 4x, 5x, 6x, 7x, right? Could be anywhere in the 5 plus order of magnitude, perhaps. Okay. Now, what has happened? In the good old days, and how many of you come from small towns? A lot of you, 50% plus, great. In small towns, what was the shopping habit? How did your mother shop when you were about 10 years back? Now, what happened in the good old days was that you went to a bazaar, all right? You went to a darji ki dukan, a tailor. You went to basically a grocer, you went to a general merchant, you went to a chemist, and if you're lucky, you went to a music shop also to buy one cassette, right? That was an event in the family. Today, you're consuming 4x categories and 4x products. Why are you consuming 4x? Basically because if you look at the last 10 years, your incomes have increased by a certain multiple order of magnitude, right? In the sense it was 2x or 3x incomes disposable. Now, what happens with this is that when basically modern trade actually started in the country in the late 2000s, let's say 90s, what were the formats people came up with? You had Food World, and I saw Food World just outside nearby, and it's empty, okay? You had, let's say, for example, Biani coming up with, let's say, his food bazaar. You actually had, subsequently, you had basically Birlas coming up with, let's say, their more. You had these guys, Easy Day coming up through Airtel, through Bharti, and so on. And Reliance came up with things. And they were all small format shops. In 2001, I had a chat with Harsh Goenka and said that, listen, I mean, why are you opening these stores? What's the rationale for this? So he said 3,000 square feet is the format, the mantra which I've discovered. And that's basically going to be my future of this company in Food World. I said, fair enough. So I just turned away and said, okay, that's your wisdom. What was happening in those days was that if you actually had your personal income, you were still consuming a very low number of SKUs and low number of categories. And therefore, the immediate response of, let's say, people was that, listen, if you actually have a value proposition, which is an air-conditioned shop on one side, MRP products, all right, and at the same time, the only convenience which you're offering is self-service, my neighborhood grocer is a phone away, and therefore I can take it from him, no problem. And therefore there's no value proposition. As a consequence, you actually had a situation, if you recall, that by 2007, more started reducing. Food world is languishing. I don't know why they're still there actually, frankly. Reliance had to shut the small shops. Easy Days are languishing. All the companies actually who had set up the small format shops, and Birla had set up 900 of them actually, right? All of them actually have closed down or closing down or the process of closing down. In 2007-2008, the so-called, let's say, consumerism started, so to speak, in terms of it suddenly reached a tipping point in which the number of categories started moving up substantially, and the 5Xs started getting operationalized into, let's say, certain buying behavior, which was not as per what we narrated, in the sense that you could not actually sort of, your mother, given your new needs, right, could not afford to actually spend so much of time buying that one SKU, right, on three visits. Instead, she wanted convenience, she wanted aggregation, she wanted, let's say, to actually get the entire categories at one shot. So suddenly the process of aggregation starts. The process of aggregation starts basically because the number of categories and SKUs you consume actually significantly goes up. And that's the time when, let's say, modern trade comes into play. Small outlets actually disappear. Funnily, now from the supplier side, and suppliers being companies like Unilever and so on, interesting things start happening. I mean, till about 2009, believe it or not, 2010 actually, my wife used to swear by the neighborhood grocer. And she used to say, why should I go to this big shop, this big bazaar or whatever it is? I will actually sort of call up a neighborhood grocer, he'll supply me everything. Now what happened is that one day I challenged her. I said, okay, give me a list. This was 2010. So she drew up a list, and then basically I said, call up the grocer. And we live in a pretty affluent part of Delhi. I live in a very affluent part of Delhi. And therefore the grocer should be stocking, let's say, my needs, logically, right? Because basically it's akin to basically my neighbors are basically at, well, let's say reasonably affluent people. She called him up, and sure enough what happened is that he said, Madam, these 5 items I don't have out of 30. Tomorrow morning I'll send it to you. All right. Have you heard of this happening? Typically it happens. Why does it happen? Because that guy does not have the velocity to actually carry them, and more importantly, the cost to serve of a company like Unilever and suppliers is so high that they cannot actually distribute it to him. So what he does is that he actually sort of goes to the wholesale market and buys 2 pieces and comes back, and then he supplies it to, let's say, my wife. So fair enough. So next day, and the story doesn't end here, by the way. Next day he supplies it, right? Now when he supplied it, everything was well with the world, till about 3 days later, he calls up again. And this is a real story, by the way. He says, Madam, wo aapne wo liya tha, some starch stuff, I don't know what it was, right? मैंने 3 पीस ले आया हूँ. I've got 3 pieces. तो 2 चाहिए आपको जो मेरे पास पड़े हुए हैं. So what was happening here was that he had to go to the wholesale market. He had to pick up 3 pieces from there, right? And he didn't have the velocity to actually throughput them, which means the traditional distribution channel, which Unilever professes by, right, had actually sort of collapsed. And because the cost to serve to the retailer is so high that they are not able to actually sort of sustain their entire distribution, especially in the context of, let's say, the newer categories, which are basically being increasingly consumed by you. Where are Unilever growths coming from, for example? They're coming from personal products. They're not coming from the rins and the wheels and the Lifebuoys. And to tell you a fact, and you won't believe this, but let me throw this number at you. In Metro, I had 2 stores in Bangalore till recently, now I have 3. You know what my wholesale contribution is? Just with these 2 stores. And this will tell you as to what the breakdown extent is. My wholesale contribution to Unilever wholesale sales is higher than 35-40%. It was 45, I reduced it to now 35 to 40. And that's the intensity of the distribution breakdown which happens once the consumerism starts, once the number of categories which you consume cannot go through that narrow channel. If you go to traditional wholesale markets, for example, I don't know how many of you visited them. They are small pokey places, 10 square feet shops, and then you shout out from outside, "Acha, iska rate kya hai? What is the rate of this?" Right? And that guy actually shouts a rate back at you, and you decide as to whether you want to buy it or not. Now, there's no merchandising, so therefore the older categories in terms of throughputing velocities of existing SKUs just remains. But at the same time, if you're getting the newer categories, it can't happen, essentially because there's no way of merchandising it, there is no way of selling it, there is no way of actually there is no canvassing as well. So therefore, if you typically go with a new launch to a wholesale market and tell the wholesaler to stock your product with a new launch, he'll say, "Acha, demand aayegi to le lenge." When the demand comes, I'll take it. And that's where the distribution breakdown happens. And that's where basically what happens is two phenomena start. Cash and carry becomes relevant because you have to actually service the retailer, which is not being serviced by the companies, essentially because the cost to serve is extremely high. And at the same time, you actually sort of have to get into a range of products. Modern trade, on the other hand, why are, let's say, the existing formats only large formats, which are 30,000, 40,000 square feet plus? Again, because of the same reason. Although the modern trade formats still have some way to go, the large formats are hypermarkets, but the cash and carry context, I think, is basically arrived already. And that's the reason why the model is turning profitable and has turned profitable. I mean, the Bangalore store actually earns world-class profitability as of now. Despite the fact that I have an MRP regime, I have, let's say, a cap on margins, but my volume throughputs are so high, and you won't believe it, one store does 500 crores. It's that sort of a volume, which we do. And therefore, we are able to actually sort of, even with, let's say, a thinner margin, able to actually sustain and behave like a wholesaler. And at the same time, because of your consumption habits, because of your income, we are able to actually sort of throughput a much larger, because we are throughput larger number of categories, because the category needs are proliferating. The need for certain categories is proliferating. So that's where we are. And I think the context in the future will be exactly the same, in the sense that while we are at a pregnant pause, and I was talking to your professor earlier in the evening, and he was asking me, how are your sales now? And I said, very good. And I'm selling at the same, my growths are at the same rate, like for like stores, right, as what they were in the last 2 years. And why? Today, the entire, let's say, proposition in terms of the customer is a value proposition. You give him value and he buys, right? And funnily, what has happened is that there is a category consolidation happening. The category consolidation is very critical in the sense that while the growth in the previous 4 to 5 years in consumers was happening because of proliferation of new categories, but now the same newer categories are actually sort of consolidating, which were hitherto new. And my growths are coming from, let's say, as of now, from that particular consolidation effort, once you basically have a value offering to the consumer, and the value-seeking behavior is so high right now, at this point of time, that if you actually sort of sync with that, and be able to actually offer categories in the right slot. And I was giving a very interesting example, and I said that let's look at bulbs. A very simple category called bulbs, right? You have CFLs, you have LEDs, and you have, let's say, the GLS, which is the old form of bulbs. What is happening is that in my older stores in Yeshwantpur and Kanakpura, I never used to sell GLS, which is the old bulb, right? The bulb which you, traditional bulb which you know. In the new store, right, I've started selling GLS now because of this value-seeking behavior. And believe it or not, it's actually sort of beating the CFLs hands down. I mean, I'm kicking myself as to why I didn't think about it 1 year back. Before that, it was irrelevant, frankly. The CFLs had taken over. But now it's retro. Getting into, let's say, the GLSs as well. Because 10 rupees versus, let's say, 100 rupees, and that's a difference. And the value-seeking behavior is so strong. And if you actually are able to discern these trends, and so what is happening right now, funnily, the GLS growths in my store at least are significantly higher than the CFL growths, despite your energy savings and so on, because of the value-seeking behavior. Now, this is one small example, but it tells you as to what you need to do dynamically to be able to stay with the times. And at the same time, the companies and the suppliers have to learn today that, listen, I mean, this so-called myth of, let's say, a behemoth distribution, unidimensional, are days of the past. You have to get into a multidimensional situation in which basically you have to get into distribution channels which are different alternatives, and so on. So anyway, as far as I'm concerned, I will end here. I don't want to take much more time. But I think basically once more I want to actually sort of remember Thiru on this particular stage, since basically that's the reason I'm here. In fact, he taught me. My first marketing course in term 1, semester 1, was actually taught by him. That's the only course he ever taught me, and that's the only linkage I had with him. After that, yes, we were together, but he never taught me after that. But definitely, I mean, he was extremely well revered. He was extremely well respected, even the times I was here. And subsequently, of course, he rose to greater heights. So I think basically, definitely, as far as I'm concerned, I dedicated this evening to him. And of course, let's say in his memory, this time to him as well. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Rajeev Bakshi. We have the unique privilege of having Mrs. Thirunarayana here with us. So may I request you to give her a copy of the book that you've just released. And may I request
dignitaries on the dais and August gathering here. Professor Thiru was not only my life partner, he was a very good friend of mine. His presence was a blessing to our family. We miss him a lot. He was an inspiration to the student fraternity. And today, we are very grateful to IIMB for this August occasion. And I'm sure Thiru would have approved this celebration of his life and works at IIMB amidst you because he loved you the most. Thank you very much.
I will request Professor Vayanar Murthy, one of the most favorite students of Thiru. He is going to regale you with all his memories. So,
it's a bad idea to stand between a big gathering and its dinner. So I won't do that. I'll make it quick and snappy. Very quickly, Professor Thiru was my teacher. For those of you who don't know, I'm a professor here. I teach marketing. I'm following his great tradition. Those of us who are in teaching, I mean, almost all of us know that we were here because of him. I mean, he virtually pulled me to this place, besides Professor Ravi Kumar and several others. Just one or two very interesting incidents connecting Professor Thiru. Was a remarkable man. In the classroom, he was something of an Amitabh Bachchan. It's very difficult actually to get that magic back. He had some very interesting personal habits. The first one was like calling everybody sir. I do the same thing, and somebody asked me, did you consciously or unconsciously imbibe this from Thiru? I might have, but the more interesting thing was there were just two differences. The first one was he would actually use it like the Kannada people call it, sir. Yes, sir. This is typically the way. And he also used to sir girls. I know it. I never do that. So that was the... I mean, in fact, first time we went to the class, he was saying, you got it, sir? You got it, sir? He was looking for it. He was talking to a girl. And then, just far too many. We'll take the night, but I'll just finish it with a couple of them, which absolutely unforgettable. I was from the 88 batch. This guy... this is a guy called Satyamurthy. We used to call him Uncle Sat. I don't know, he dropped off the map. I don't see him anywhere. He doesn't come to alumni gatherings. There is one running right now, my batch. I don't know where the fellow is. He simply dropped off. This guy had this habit of, most IIM graduates inculcate this. Talking long sentences which don't necessarily make sense, but a lot of sound. I mean, that kind of a man. He's actually specialized that. The sentences used to run into pages, and many times in case discussions it's very useful because everybody loses the thread after some time. I mean, in any case, we trailed off after some time. We didn't know what he was talking about. And Thiru asked a question, and this guy went on and after his long suo moto statement, Thiru looked at him, and this is typical Thiru fashion. He would say, "Sir, don't reflex, sir. Reflect, sir." And it is absolutely incredible. This was his way of saying, "Shut up." Very beautifully, but that's what I liked about him. You know, he could slap you, but he would slap you on the wrist. I haven't seen really people who were so smart at it. I just didn't get that. I wish he was stayed longer. You know, some of these tricks are really worth. Some of these legends and the reality get so mixed with myths. I never really checked the story, but this tradition was doing rounds in hostels when we were there. Same very hostel, same concrete blocks. There was this one batch had a serious panga with one of the teachers, and I believe the teacher went on a hartal. He said, "I won't teach this batch." It really came to a kind of crisis, and when he exited, Thiru was brought in. I mean, he is like the Don Bradman, so he was sent into the classroom. I was like, classes, there's no question. I mean, yeah, the Tendulkar is a bad man. That's all known. But the more interesting thing was the exam. He wanted to fix these guys so that they'd never do this kind of a thing with any prof anytime again. But he would do it with such great finesse. Said, yes, sir, all important topics, sir. Kotler, sir, please read, sir. End of the chapter questions, sir. And he would go. And then everybody's reading because the next day is a marketing exam. And then somewhere, I think, somewhere around 10 o'clock in the night or so, he sends important topics in Kotler, sir. One bunch of... So this is put in the notice board. In those days, there was no email. So you had to physically put... And imagine this guy actually carrying this, sticking up in the notice board and all the... Oh my God, what is this, boss? All the, oh gosh, this is what is coming tomorrow. All right, read up again, go back and read up all those things that were left off. And the next day you go there, yes, sir, 40 pages Hero Honda case, sir. So it is a case actually. After you read up this whole thing, 40 pages of case. You're, yes, sir, please apply all those concepts here, sir. And that, so like, isn't that vintage Thiru? Isn't that vintage Thiru? That's him. Then and after 2 hours, it's a 3-year exam. After 2 hours, he comes in and says, sir, channel aspect is extremely important in this case, sir. Please have a look at it, sir. And then he exits. Sir, 40 pages फिर से पढ़ना पड़ेगा because you have forgotten. So, absolutely. And then after the exam, at least the toppers would go and ask the prof, sir, what was the channel aspect? Sir, I was just trying to psych you, sir. There was no channels. I mean, he wanted to rag you. He really used to do a terrific job of it. I loved him every minute. And the kind of hints he used to give us, and very useful after joining here. He was a titan, and I had to teach in the class next to him. It's very difficult to brush shoulders with those great guys. And he would call everybody sir, and he would call his colleagues Vadyar. Typical, so Vadyar. I would say Vadyar. Be very sure of the last session Vadyar. That's very, very important. Some very interesting. International programs Vadyar. 3.5 out of 4 should be good enough for you. And he very clear tell you, look, this is it. If you haven't crossed this, then you haven't made the mark. Extremely useful actually for for somebody like me who was kind of climbing the greasy pole. That's it. I think we really, really miss him. Every Guru Purnima day, I used to go to him and offer him something. And whether I did it or not, my wife used to tell me, look, tomorrow is Guru Purnima, make sure I have brought these things. And I think I should thank her really. Please go to Thiru. And I would go every day. Once he said, Vadyar, I'm very busy. He was always busy. I mean, there was never a time when he was not busy. He would take a walk with BKC Vadyar. After that, I'm going straight to GE, etc., etc. And then I barged into his house. And he was actually shaving, half shaving. And I gave this bunch of fruits. Almost tears in his eyes. I mean, I could see that. Extremely touched by these small gestures, which only great people can. I think great man and a great lecture befitting that great man who was the platinum standard of all teaching that we could ever aspire of. And if someday we get there, it must be courtesy him. Thank you very much. And may his soul rest in peace. I think he'll always be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, I wish this evening can go on, but if there is one luxury we all don't have, that's time. So I would like to bring this evening to a closure. But before that, I would like all of you to join me in mentioning what has been discussed by Rajeev and by Professor Vayalar and also by Professor Raghunath, that I think we at the Institute are blessed to have Professor Thiru as one of our gurus. And if you remember, that has been discussed by Rajeev and by Professor Vayalar and also by Professor Raghunath, that I think we at the Institute are blessed to have Professor Thiru as one of our gurus. And if you remember the famous quotation, Guru Gobind Do Khade, I think it's a fact that we should all bow in front of the Guru. So Madam, thank you so much for coming here. It's a great honor. And before I end, I would like to request Professor Raghunath to give a token of appreciation to Mr. Rajeev Bakshi. Rajeev, thank you so much for coming here. And here is something from our side. Thank you. And my dear friends, members of alumni, faculty, colleagues, staff, and students, thanks a lot for coming and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.